Dream Tower Media presents The Literary Wonder and Adventure Show, hosted by Robert Zoltan, with Edgar the Raven.
Howdy do.
This episode, The Golden Age of Science Fiction, a conversation with author Allen Steele. Captain's log. Stardate. Actually, I have no idea what a stardate is. Hey folks, it's Robert Zoltan. I'm here with Edgar the Raven.
Rock, howdy do.
We're speaking in hushed voices because we are awestruck, wonder-filled, even reverent at the experience of being here. And where are we? Space. It's really f***ing big. How did the Dream Tower end up in deep space? Well, it seems like it was only yesterday that we were in the Hyborian Age, talking with Howard Andrew Jones.
It was yesterday.
Hey, don't step on my flashback transition.
I'll handle this. Folks, it really was only yesterday that we were in the midst of a jungle in the Hyborian Age.
Well, Edgar, another episode is under our belts, and apart from a few tiddly bits, we're about done with spring cleaning.
What about that thing under the couch?
I think I'm going to need help with that. But for now, I'm just going to take a well-deserved nap.
Later, the tower is shifting.
Oh, rats. Okay, well, hang on. I better be awake to see where we end up next. What's happening? Feels like the tower's being ripped apart.
Red alert! Red alert!
Red alert? I didn't even know we had a red alert. Check out the portal. Where are we?
Holy moly! We're in deep space!
Space? What do you mean, space?
See for yourself.
Oh my god. We're in space. The Dream Tower can't survive in space.
It's not!
Holy sh! We're gonna fucking die!
Pull yourself together, man.
Ow. Oh, thanks. I needed that.
More action, less panic.
Right. Okay, I can do this. First Officer Raven.
Aye, Captain.
Secure the hull.
How?
I don't know. Push a few of those flashing buttons.
If you say so.
It worked.
Well done, Captain.
It was nothing. We're fine. We're alive. You're breathing, I'm breathing. The Dream Tower is holding together. True, we're floating in the middle of outer space. But that's okay. That's just fine. I'm fine with that. Really. I'm just fine.
Captain! Captain? Uh-oh. And that, folks, is how we ended up here.
Hey, wait a minute. I don't remember screaming like a little girl, and I don't remember fainting.
Of course you don't. You were unconscious.
Oh, yeah. I guess that makes sense. Wait.
The dream phone.
Wow. Either it's aliens or someone's got a strong signal to reach us out here, wherever we are. Edgar?
Howdy do.
Hello, Edgar. It's Allen Steele.
Allen Steele, Avengers on the Moon.
Oh, hey, Alan. It's Robert. What's up?
I was just calling in to do the show.
The show? No, you're going to be on the show in June.
This is June.
No, it's May.
No, it's June.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm for sure.
Uh-oh.
Alan, can I call you right back?
Well, it might not be a good idea. I'm calling from Tycho Moon Base, and the signal is spotty. I had a hard time reaching you.
Oh, I'm not surprised. What are you doing on the moon?
I need a quiet place to write for a few days.
I see. Well, can I put you on hold?
Yeah, it'll be fine.
Thanks. Be back in a minute.
How in the name of Gallifrey did we lose a month?
I don't know. Something happened when the tower shifted. A whole month. No break. No nap.
No rest for the wicked.
You can say that again.
No rest for the
Don't
wicked.
do that. Okay. Well, as we always say, the show must go on. Well, folks, our guest this June is science fiction author Allen Steele, winner of the Hugo, Locus, and Robert A. Heinlein Awards, among others. He was also nominated for the Nebula, Sturgeon, and Sidewise Awards. His new novel, Avengers of the Moon, is a retro science fiction adventure which Galaxy's Edge magazine calls a wonderful combination of nostalgic space opera, humor, and contemporary storytelling, and Locus magazine calls an authentic, heartfelt, and evocative novel. So without further loss of time, let's welcome Allen Steele. Edgar? Sorry, Alan. Bit of confusion on our end. We seem to have lost a month somehow.
Oh, I understand. It happens to me all the time when I have a deadline.
I'll bet. Well, welcome to Literary Wonder and Adventure Show.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be on the show.
You're on the East Coast, right? What state are you in?
I live in a little town called Whately, Massachusetts, and it's in the western part of the state, a little farm town. But we've got quite a number of writers, and particularly SF writers, out around here. I've got Jane Yolen lives in Hatfield, which is the next town over, and John Crowley lives in Conway, over next town over in the other opposite direction, and Jim Cambius and Rajna Vajnar and quite a number of other people all live right around here. And, of course, we only see each other at science fiction conventions.
Right. So how far? I mean, how far are you apart? Like an hour, 2 hours from?
Oh, no more. Oh, no more than from each other. We're only like 5 minutes away from each other.
Oh my gosh! Wow. Okay.
I mean, no, we're it's this area has just got writers and artists and everybody all living out here, and it's really quite nice.
That's really interesting. Why in this small area, this kind of country area, do you get all this little concentration of fantastic fiction writers?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we've got right here in the Pioneer Valley, we've got 5 major colleges and about another half a dozen or so small colleges. We've got a lot of these people, writers and artists and so forth, moonlight as instructors. The other thing is it's a great place to live. It's very quiet. Nobody looks at you bug-eyed when you tell them that you're a writer, because everybody is. I moved out here 20 years ago this next month. And it's honestly the best place I've ever lived.
Wow. You get some nice snow out in the east, right?
Oh, it's great. I mean, one of the reasons why as you probably can tell from the accent, I was born and raised down south in Tennessee. But one of the reasons why I've lived in New England most of my adult life is because of the snow. I like to cross-country ski and snowshoe. And it's for winter sports, this area can't be beat.
Yeah. Cross-country skiing is fun. I did it with my brother. My older brother lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And once I was there, and they get some pretty serious snow there in Michigan too. Yeah,
I mean, the thing about it is that when you live out here, you can, there's one or two ways that people react to inclement weather, and one of them is to curl up into yourself inside of the house and do whatever it is that you do inside of a house for 6 months,
right?
And you eventually go stir crazy doing that. I mean, it can really drive you nuts.
Yeah.
Or you learn to dress warm and get out there and have fun rolling around in the snow.
Yeah. And if you get used to the temperature, Kurt Vonnegut, he did an address at some college, and he was saying, listing all these things you should do in your life. And he said, live in New York, but leave before it makes you hard. Live in San Francisco, but leave before it makes you soft.
Yeah. Actually, Vonnegut in the last years of his life lived in Northampton, which is the next nearest town over. He was teaching creative writing at Smith College, and it was really very funny because I think I was the only person not to see him. I was always arriving in some place like 5 minutes after Kurt Vonnegut had been there.
That sounds like a story. There's a story in that.
Oh, it gets even worse. I mean, there was one time my wife and I were out at dinner. We went to this favorite Chinese restaurant in Northampton, and we were sitting there eating, and I was facing her, and my back was turned towards the door. And I vaguely noticed while we were talking that everybody was looking up and looking past me, but I didn't see what was going on. And Linda waited a few minutes, and she said, Kurt Vonnegut just walked by. What? Did you notice everybody looking up? Kurt Vonnegut's just left the restaurant.
Oh, my gosh.
He walked right behind you, Alan. I was like, why did you do that?
Alan, I'm serious. That sounds like, I mean, the title could be like, 5 minutes after Kurt Vonnegut left or something like that. And you could write a science fiction story.
Yeah, it was like this went on for 2 or 3 years. It's
like your anthology of Tales. Was it Tales of Time and Space?
Yeah. Actually, that would be a pretty good short story. Yeah.
And it seems that what I liked about Tales of Time and Space was that there was a huge variety in there of stories and of when they took place, and some were almost. The one, the horror in Jekyll Island, was almost a Lovecraftian story, except for the nature of the thing they find, which I won't give away. But
believe me, I was so when I was writing that one, I was so attempted to bring in something that was, you're right, much more Lovecraftian, like a Cthulhu or something of that nature. And then I looked at that and I said, no, everybody's done Cthulhu. And of course, the story takes place in the 1930s, so these gentlemen don't have the technical vocabulary for what they have found.
Right.
I mean, they don't know about theories of biomechanical organisms or things like that. You can't even tell what this thing, which giving away a little bit to people who haven't read the story, they find this thing washed up on the beach that looks vaguely dinosaur-like. That was an interesting story in its genesis, because I was about the first 5 pages or so is actually true. Right. I mean, Jekyll Island at the turn of the century was the winter escape for New York high society. So this was the place where the Donald Trumps of that day went to in the winter,
right?
To hang out and effectively plot the outcome of the world. I mean,
right.
there was a lot of deal making going on Jekyll Island.
So it's like the Bilderberg Conference kind of thing or whatever, right?
A little bit like that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, but much more informally. I mean, these guys would go out there and make deals on the tennis court.
Right. Yes. It was under the semblance of just a vacation, but they were
exactly
plotting to overthrow countries.
Well, I mean, this is where the history records that the Federal Reserve System was thought up.
Oh boy,
down in Jekyll Island. That these
some bad karma on that island.
But on the other hand, the first transatlantic telephone call was made from the island too.
Oh, interesting.
The very first public test of the transatlantic cable between the U.S. and England, the U.S. endpoint was out. It was sitting outside the big hotel there with Teddy Roosevelt, I believe it was, officiating over there. And so the island has this storied history. While I was walking around there for my niece's wedding, I just began to think of this story, which is kind of what happens with me a lot of times, is that I start daydreaming, and before I know it, I'm pulling out my pad and writing down notes for something that just occurred to me. I've got this long-standing interest in the history of science fiction. I've been studying the field, for quite a long time now, and from a historical perspective. And it's one of those things that the more you dig into it, the more interesting it becomes, and especially when you start hearing the stories told by the old timers about the early days of the field and so forth. See, this is one of the things that fascinates me about the particular period, the 30s to 40s and the pulp era, really. Because science fiction really did come out of the pulps, I believe. I mean, yeah, I know it goes all the way back. People trace it back usually to Mary Shelley or Jules Verne at the very least. But I believe that these were kind of the warm up, and the real first act began in 1926 with Hugo Gernsback starting Amazing Stories, and that this was the place where science fiction became the genre that we call science fiction. It was no longer just a form of fantasy that was out there that nobody really had a name for.
So it'd be fair to say, in a sense, the golden age of science fiction, and it does refer to a specific exact period, or is this a flexible thing?
Well, I mean, again, it depends on a lot of things, including your reading of history and so forth, and how you define science fiction and so forth. The way I define it is that as a genre, as a distinct genre, it began with Amazing Stories, which makes it fairly recent.
That's what I was going to say. So the golden age of science fiction, therefore, in a sense, is when it became solid as a genre,
Yeah, the golden age, well, what people refer to as the golden age usually started in the late 1930s, and most people trace it to, in fact, they often say it's the July 1939 issue of Astounding Stories was the real beginning of it, because yeah, it's very specific, because this was the issue where A.E. Van Vogt and Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and a couple of other major writers all had stories in there at once, and some classic stories. And what's and most people now you refer to the golden age, and everybody says, "Oh, Heinlein," and sometimes they'll mention Asimov, and they might even mention Ray Bradbury or Arthur C. Clarke, who came late in the period. But what was really going on during that time was a lot of different writers, some of whom who had been in there writing SF for quite a while, since the 1920s, like Murray Leinster.
Yes.
Murray Leinster and my favorite Edmund Hamilton, who later created Captain Future,
which is the Avengers on the Moon. The new book is a Captain Future book, and so that's based on
It's a reboot it's a reboot, remake, whatever you want to call it, of this classic pulp hero of the 1940s, and there was an explosion of these writers who were coming out there, and it's because science fiction was still a relatively new genre. It was there's so many of the ideas that we now accept as being tropes, that we're all very, 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 very familiar with. For the First Contact story, I mean, the time travel. Well, that goes back to Wells.
Space travel, really.
Space travel, particularly. Space travel was one of the major themes from the very beginning. Alternate history. I mean, the very first alternate history story was Murray Leinster's Sidewise in Time, and it was published in, I think, 1935, 1936 in Astounding. I mean, you can trace right back to there. So,
what about invasion stories? Is that later? Invasion stories?
Well, War of the Worlds was probably the first one.
Oh, that's quite early, of course. Yeah.
But I'm speaking of Edmund Hamilton. I mean, I'm on my desk here while I was waiting for you to call. I was reading in the Best of Amazing Stories of 1928. I was reading a story by Edmund Hamilton. In fact, it was his first published story, Comet Doom, which was in the 1928 issue of Amazing.
Wow!
And it was an alien invasion story. Back then, but it was, again, one of the first treatments. So there's this tremendous sense. You go back and you read in that period, you read these old magazines, you read the anthologies, and you see this tremendous sense of invention, that this is all new. And people people are taking these ideas and throwing them at the wall left and right and seeing what sticks.
And people were, the thing is, it was also how prolific the period was, because, you know, we talk about Shelley, and you could even point to, well, several. I mean, of course, you know, Stevenson, Jules Verne,
Sure.
H.G. Wells, but even before, Mary Shelley. Trying to think of another. You know, back then, the wonderful thing back then was that there weren't such tight genres. Maybe in the time that people lived, they did consider, you know, a certain kind of writing, but
well, it's even today. I mean, you know, a strong case can be made that science fiction was invented by Edgar Allan Poe, because some of the things that he wrote were science fictional. But you mentioned Edgar Allan Poe to most people, and they think, oh, horror,
yeah. But he wrote
or mystery.
And by the way, Edgar's a huge Edgar Allan Poe fan, so
Yay, Poe, Poe, Poe.
There you go. So you ought to go. A couple of years ago, I was in Richmond, Virginia. I was a guest at a science fiction convention there, RavenCon, appropriately enough.
Ooh, RavenCon.
RavenCon?
Yeah, and I went to visit Poe's childhood home, and caught a lot of that. And if you're ever in Richmond, go visit the Poe house. It's pretty awesome.
I want to go.
Oh, someday, sweetie, someday. No shush.
But you know, but here it was. I mean, here was Edgar Allan Poe, who's writing. I mean, he's inventing really the modern detective story. He is probably inventing science fiction to a certain degree, and of course, he's inventing the classic horror story. And nobody was even calling him any of these things. These are just more of these strange stories that some drunk down in Richmond.
Right. Well, that was a wonderful thing. He wrote, you know, and he wrote funny stories. And satire and all kinds of stuff. And people, very much, you know, it's such a modern thing, the schism of categorizing and subcategorizing everything so much. And that's what I love about the writing before that time. I mean, I agree. And I mean, I love the golden age of science fiction and all that. And that's why I wanted to do a couple of shows on it. But it was really a kind of exciting back at the time that people were just writing these stories of a great imagination. And I did see I was at a little vintage store that has, like, they only carry mint condition, like, vintage paperbacks and stuff. And there was a book there, and I almost picked it up. Mm-hmm. And it was like a science fiction anthology. But the authors, it was crazy. The authors were like 2/3 or 3/4 of them were super famous literary writers. I'm talking about from the early 20th century.
Stephen Vincent Benet, and you know, and I know what you're talking about.
Well, Lawrence Durrell, I love Lawrence Durrell, who wrote the Alexandria Quartet. I have his book, I haven't read it yet, Tunk, that's about a guy that has his corporation. He builds this giant supercomputer. Mm-hmm. It's basically a science fiction. He considered the Alexandria Quartet a science fiction. I don't know if you ever read. He was so strange.
It's real funny. Many years ago, when I was a freshman in college, I was studying at a school, New England College, and I had a very good writing teacher. In fact, he's become quite well known, novelist Russell Banks. And he had and I was one of Russell's creative writing students. And another person who was in the room, and Russell knew who he was. I didn't know who he was. I don't think any of the other did. But there was a guy by the name of Brad Durrell, and that was Lawrence Durrell's son.
Oh my God!
He would argue, and Brad was very disappointed in me, because here I was a science fiction fan and I'd never read his father's story, and I could never explain to him. He said, I have no idea who your father is, man.
Well, I tell you what, Lawrence Durrell he's not an easy read, but it's worth it. It's worth it. But
I have been told that he is. One of these days I will read the Alexandria Quartet. I mean, there's a number of great books that I have not read, and those
I'm the same way. I don't know. I'm sorry.
One of these days I'll do. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, somehow I came upon him, and I really don't remember how. But I would say just to pick up Justine, the first book, and read the first page, and you'll read it, because the first page is. I go back and read the first 2 pages of that often, just because it's some of the best writing I've ever read by anyone. There's no better writing than the first 2 pages of that book by anyone ever. And I'm not saying it's better than anybody else. You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying that you can't write better than that. It's the most beautiful, poetic, evocative, provocative, mysterious, fantastic use of language. The thing about Durrell is what's great about him is you will read sentences that you have never read before, and that's hard with a language that is the same that everyone uses, right?
Yeah, it is amazing when you run into a writer who is like that. I mean, it's one that I've been reading, Limbo by Bernard Wolfe.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this has become a kind of an obscure novel. It is science fiction. It was his only science fiction novel, and and I think it's just recently been come back into print. And the language you can almost get drunk on. I mean, it's just so rich.
Yes.
I mean, this is not but it is not a quick read. It is not an easy read.
But those are the kind of books I think for a writer. That's why Michael Moorcock talked about. He's like, you shouldn't be even reading in your genre. You should be reading in like all the genres, all the other genres. Don't read fantasy if you're a fantasy writer, because you read writers often, like you said, tropes. You fall into things if you are reading the same in the genre that you're in.
Yeah.
The other people that they may be good writers, but just like you, you're pulling off things that from this genre. If you read that, you're going to pull things from the genre that are already second or third or fourth hand.
Right. I agree with Mike to a certain extent.
Well, he's he's zealous about his ideas.
Well, sure he is, and here it is. I mean, when I'm writing, I don't read new SF. I mean, I just can't.
Right. I agree with you on that. Yeah.
When something in which means that there's a lot of SF that's been published in the last 20, 30 years that everybody raves about and I haven't read because I'm always writing.
I know.
I mean,
yes.
I mean, I really have to like take a vacation or do something and then say, okay, now I'll read a new novel.
Right.
However, I think that there's a lot to be said for reading the classics while you're writing.
Let me make it a quick aside. That Michael Moorcock said that quite a while ago. I don't know if he still believes that. If he does, I'll just say I apologize, Michael, because I still do occasionally pick up Elric to read it to get inspiration.
Well, I sincerely doubt that he's going to be. I sincerely doubt that he'd be offended by that at all. Nobody.
Stop reading Elric.
Yeah, nobody ever says don't read my books. I mean,
right.
that's just not fair.
Don't read in your genre unless I wrote in it.
Yeah, right. But no, reading the classics is and studying them is I think is an intrinsic part of becoming and staying a writer.
You mean the classics in general, or in your genre, or just both?
Both.
Yes.
Really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I agree, of course, reading extensively outside of the genre. When I'm not reading SF for pleasure, I'm usually reading mysteries, suspense, things of this nature. And there's a lot of writers lately that I've been discovering, like Cornell Woolrich and Ross MacDonald.
Oh, yes.
Learning a lot from these guys and reading their work.
That's the thing, is when you read, like I had never read. I think it was Zane Grey, not Lou L'Amour.
Zane Grey, yeah.
And it's a Western. I thought, why don't I read it? And funny thing is, I read it, and it gives me more ideas for sword and sorcery than reading fantasy. Whenever I watch those spaghetti Westerns.
Yeah.
Those old spaghetti Westerns, to me, those are the closest thing to good sword and sorcery movies that have ever been made. I know it's strange to say, but usually fantasy fans that really understand the genre, they get that, because it's the whole, they haven't made many good fantasy movies. They're all so badly done and over and too epic. Sword and sorcery is about just like the Westerns.
In a different milieu.
Yeah. It's just there's guys going off in the desert, and there's a lot of mystery, and it's just survival, and they're living by their wits, and that's the element.
I mean, there's certainly a lot to be said for that. I mean, two of the greatest fantasy writers of the pulp era, Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard, also wrote Westerns.
Right.
People don't remember their Westerns that much because they remember Tarzan and Conan. Mm-hmm. But they're there. I mean, Theodore Sturgeon wrote Westerns. I mean, I've got one of his hard-to-find collections is called Sturgeon's Westerns, and these are the ones that he published in the Western Stories pulp. I've actually seen a couple of issues out there. there's quite a number of writers who, until publishing became really stratified,
Right.
during I think really started happening was in the 80s. Then it was not only accepted but expected that a
Right.
writer who is going to be writing in one genre would also be writing in others. And go into we have a lot.
Well, you're saying starting the 80s, writers, they didn't write usually in more than one genre.
They were discouraged.
Right, discouraged, right.
They began to be discouraged.
That's interesting because if you look at, we're talking about the golden age of science fiction and that it was mainly the pulp era, and almost all of those writers wrote in different genres.
Sure. I mean, sometime or another, if you're ever in an old magazine store, or next time you're in an old bookstore, and you see like a pile of Ellery Queen's or Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazines, and they seem to be fairly commonplace, go look through them, and you'll be surprised how many science fiction writers are propped up in those pages. I mean, you go into them and you find Isaac Asimov, you find Avram Davidson, Robert Bloch, Harlan Ellison.
Yes.
All these guys who were writing over there too.
I blame the publishing industry for this.
I do. Oh, I know to blame the publishing industry. I mean, I had it when I first got started into the field. When I started, when I transitioned over from being a journalist to a science fiction writer, the first 2 or 3 novels that I wrote, of course, were SF. And then it began to occur to me, I'd like to try my hand at fantasy. In fact, I had an idea for a story that would now be called urban fantasy. That title had not yet been invented, so I was kind of ahead of the curve on things. And I pitched this to one of my editors, and she just said, "No, I don't want this from you." And she wouldn't even let me finish the pitch all the way. She said, "No, I don't want this." And I said, "Why? I think it's a really terrific idea." And she said, "I've got 100 fantasy writers. I don't have that many science fiction writers. You're a science fiction writer."
It's to the detriment of the writer and the public.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of nerve to be able to do that now, and there's very few writers who can go from genre to genre, even within subgenre to subgenre.
But it was a common thing until Fritz Leiber, one of my favorite writers of all time. Oh yeah, and absolutely. I went into a horror bookstore in Burbank, which shall remain nameless, but that doesn't really matter because there's probably only one horror book. I'm sure there's only one horror bookstore in Burbank.
Yeah, right.
They didn't have a single Fritz Leiber book, and I went up and I asked the guy, who's all gothed out,
yeah,
why didn't there any Fritz Leiber books? He said, well, Fritz Leiber wasn't really a horror writer.
Oh, gee, God.
That's so indicative of that attitude, and also just indicative of the sadness I feel over the horror genre, and we're not going to get into that. It's not the subject, and probably do a show on it. There's people trying to save it.
We'll stop that rant before it gets started. Yeah.
Okay, so we talk about science fiction, or talk about horror. Let's talk about romance. Let's talk about literary novel. Let's talk about a novel of manners. Frankenstein fits in all of those.
Yeah. And I think in the past there was a lot more acceptance of crossing genre lines, and than there is now. Science fiction, unfortunately, has become horribly stratified in that way, and it's a bit frustrating to be a writer right now in the field, because you have to be able to convince editors and sometimes readers that different is good. Okay,
right.
It's okay to try something that doesn't follow, your expectations of what this story is about. I read a reader review of just recently. I found where somebody reviewed one of my early novels, and in fact, it was my first novel, Orbital Decay. And he complained that there wasn't much action going on in this novel. And then I realized, and I got about halfway through, and I realized, no, there weren't going to be any spaceship battles here. Mm-hmm. That this was going to be about people. And after I learned to accept that, I liked the novel a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, well, at least this guy had an open mind. At least he got into a novel about space, and when the Death Star didn't show up, he didn't throw the book across the room.
Yeah.
It's horrible to think that that's actually a mindset that'd be out there.
Well, it's become, like I said, I blame the publishing industry, but now, I mean, I'm on some of these Facebook pages, and you're on a sword and sorcery page or whatever, and somebody dares to post something about Edgar Rice Burroughs, and they're like, kind of connection of the ego being like anything that's against your opinion is its personal attack on you. And they're just freaking out if anything's posted that's even slightly outside the subject or the genre of the page.
Yeah.
And that's just so silly and so stratified. You miss so much of life by narrowing your vision like that. That's just
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've learned from reading a lot of classic SF, and the stuff that people can still read, the stuff that has passed the test of time, is the work that you can pick up cold, not knowing what this story is about, not knowing anything, and read and make sense out of it.
Right.
And this is why a lot of the stuff from the Golden Age survives. It's also the reason why a lot of the stuff from the Golden Age doesn't survive. I mean,
why, Alan? Then tell me, what is it that makes the good stuff survive? What is the good stuff? What is it in it that makes it, even if you read it and you know that it's dated, like you hand the person the story typewritten and they read it and they know it wasn't written this year simply because of something historical. That's not dated to me. That's just historical facts. So you know it's not written this year, but why does it hold up? What is it that makes it story timeless, apart from good writing?
Well, that's a really hard one because it really is.
Yes.
I mean, this is one of those where, every time you name an example, you can find a counterexample. I think the timelessness comes in, again, from if you can pick up the story cold and it's not so tied to its particular time.
Right.
That's one thing. I mean, you can. Let me see if I can. Okay, a good example. Nightfall, Isaac Asimov. Still very, very readable story. And there is no real date. There is no real place. It happens on a distant world somewhere out there. It may be Earth. No, it can't be Earth. But it certainly seems Earth-like in a way. And if all goes well in history, that story will remain around, and people will be reading it, until literally a nightfall does occur.
But the scientific accuracy isn't important, really, right? I mean, is it? I mean,
right, exactly,
right.
Exactly, because Asimov was playing around with a concept. If you're familiar with Nightfall, which theoretically might have been possible back then, but I'm not sure you could actually have this situation occur in nature as we understand it.
Right.
But it doesn't matter. Who cares?
Exactly.
It's a great story.
Well, that's it's to have a story that is still even scientifically possible. I think you have to be writing stuff like Cordwainer Smith. It's almost mythical. Like Cordwainer Smith is possibly him and Bester are my favorites. And when you read Cordwainer Smith's stories, they're almost like fantasy. I mean, they're almost like mythology. It's so far in the future. He's not writing about the technology. He mentions it.
Going into Cordwainer Smith and trying to pick it apart as if it was a hard SF story, it would be a foolish thing to do. I mean, you would miss the point.
Yes,
of the story
because it is like science fiction mythology. That's how I feel like his.
Yeah, well, it's a perfect fusion. I think of a lot of Smith's stories, like a lot of Zelazny's, like Phil Dick, that these a number of other different writers. That they really are walking that thin line between science fiction and fantasy. And I mean, Zelazny, Smith, Bradbury
so much, yes. Leiber too. Leiber, yeah.
Leiber, Lee Brackett, many other writers.
Burroughs, obviously, he was writing like fantasy.
Burroughs,
Yeah.
and they walk that line between science fiction and fantasy. And I mean, you could split hairs over it and try to decide, which it is, or pick it apart because look, brackets Mars can't possibly exist now, so therefore we might as well ignore all of our work.
Well, let's go back to Avengers: The Moon. Edmund Hamilton, he was one of these of the Golden Age writers. Your introduction to Avengers on the Moon reminded me of the introduction to The Stars My Destination. Was that a conscious nod or?
No, actually, it's kind of a curious thing. No, now I'm going to have to go back and look at Stars My Destination.
Oh yeah, because it starts out like it was a time of this and it was a time of that, and that reminds me of the way you wrote your intro.
No, I mean, it wasn't a conscious thing at all. I wouldn't have even remembered it if you hadn't told me. Of course, I've read.
Yeah, go back and read it.
Yeah, I have to go back. I've read it a couple of times. Of course, it's one of the greatest science fiction novels ever written, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree.
But I mean, actually, if it was anything that if I was thinking of anything, it was Tale of Two Cities, Dickens. The beginning,
of course. Well, that's probably where Bester got it from.
Probably did. Everybody rips off Dickens.
Dickens and Shakespeare.
I was about to say it's Shakespeare. Absolutely the two most purloined writers in the English language.
So why
they should demand royalties?
Oh my God! Well, okay. You're gonna see. John O'Neill from Blackgate's gonna be frustrated. I'm gonna be so off subject again. He criticized me one time for that because there's too much. I'm sorry, there's too much to talk about, John. I can't stick to the subject because the subject is life on this show. Okay. Even if you make the subject as small as writing, you still can't keep it in a box. Yeah. Once you open that genie bottle, Shakespeare. Because I read a book about that, about like. Shakespeare was Shakespeare because back then there's no copyright laws like that. They relaxed all those kind of laws, and there's all these reasons that Shakespeare became Shakespeare. I don't know if you ever read that book. I'm talking about Imagine. Actually, I'm talking about Imagine. It was about like how his genius created, and it talked a lot about the playwrights of that period and why Shakespeare never would have become Shakespeare if they hadn't relaxed these kind of legal laws, because he was ripping his plots off everybody. Yeah. And he would never have gone to school, but they created a thing where working class people's sons get to go to university for free. Otherwise, he never would have gone. Shakespeare never would have been. So there's these things you can create to create an environment, to create genius, because I'm sure there's geniuses walking around the world. We just don't cultivate them. And the golden age, sorry, go ahead. I was going to bring this back to the golden age of science fiction. That period happened for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Because it was cultivated.
Yes, for many reasons. Many things happened. I mean, the paper industry, publishing.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about the pulp era is that it actually had a kind of criminal origins.
Interesting.
Somebody chronicled this actually in a book on comics, Men of Tomorrow, and I can't remember the author. And he was talking, which is a history of comics. He points out something that's really very interesting, is that, of course, comics came out of the pulps. I mean, the comics publishers, most of them started as pulp publishers. I mean, it's almost been forgotten that Marvel Comics was once Marvel Science Fiction, which was a failing science fiction magazine. Wow. But these the pulps got started during Prohibition. Because what it was that the bootleggers had to find ways of smuggling Canadian whiskey down from up north from Canada into the United States. And they hit on the idea of putting them inside of big rolls of paper that had been made up in Canada. You know, they cut the trees up in Canada and they make rolls of pulp paper. And then they'd hide somebody had the idea of hiding the booze deep within the rolls of paper where customs wouldn't find them. So, of course, it means that you're going to make this work, you got to be bringing down an awful lot of paper roll, and you've got to account for it some way or the other. So some of these mobs began going into Prohibition era mobs began putting the money into paper, into publishing, and they started by publishing magazines. There's one famous one called Artists and Models that were sold. They were nudie magazines, and they were sold in speakeasies and so forth. Well, then there was a crackdown on that, so they had to find something else, and they lit on fiction magazines. So a lot of those magazines came out because they were basically fronts originally for bootlegging operations. So we can owe that to and then what happened was, of course, Prohibition comes to an end. But by that time, we had a healthy publishing industry.
That's so. I mean, that is just bizarre. That's how history is. People think, history books make it sound a certain way, but it is so strange. Just like that thing, how beer saved the world. You ever watch that special?
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
It's amazing. And so you're saying so basically, we wouldn't have modern science fiction movement. We wouldn't have modern science fiction probably if it wasn't for Prohibition.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, Amazing Stories was published by one of those. Probably it was experimental publications, and it was Hugo Gernsback, and that was one of the magazines. And he probably had some backing from somebody. And then the pulps just they took off on their own. And they were and this is where a lot of American, it's not just science fiction, but the detective story, the Western story, the romance story, all these different population.
All the genres, everything owe themselves to the pulp.
Popular literature came out, took off during the pulp era, and the pulp era in part took off because of prohibition.
Prohibition, yeah. How strange. I mean, well, and that kind of made it.
Thank you, Carrie Nation. We appreciate this.
Well, it's like I said, it's not that these things didn't exist, but they became kind of codified. Like they became a system of printing all of these magazines. So therefore, there was a demand. So then you had a supply of writers starting to write it and you can make a living off writing back then.
Well, that was see what happened in science fiction.
I'm sorry, you can make a living writing for magazines.
You could make a living if you were fast and if you didn't over specialize. If you could, I mean, this is why writers during that time. They were getting. If they had a magazine that paid a penny a word, that was actually pretty good. Some of them were less than that. But you could make a living in New York during that time, writing for these magazines.
And a penny a word back then compared to what is paid by magazines now is pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's about 6 to 10 cents a word. Depending on which magazine you're writing for.
And only a few pay that now.
Well, see what's happening now with electronic media is kind of what happened. History is repeating itself. The pulps got wiped out in the 1950s by the advent of paperbacks, which in turn were kind of an invention of World War II. The paperbacks, mass market paperbacks, came along. And by 1955, the last of the pulps were either gone or had evolved into digest magazines like Astounding in its later years, and Galaxy, Fantasy, and Science Fiction, and so forth. I think the same thing is happening now in ebooks. I think what is happening is the advent of ebooks. What is getting wiped out step by step is the mass market paperback. The hardcover is still doing well. The trade paperback is still doing well. But I think in 10 years, there's going to be like 2 authors published in paperback. One is going to be Stephen King,
and the other Stephen King,
and the other one's going to be John Grisham.
Oh, I was going to say Michael Crichton. He might still, if he's still around.
No, he's not still around. They may still be reprinting Michael Crichton.
Anything they make a movie off of, they'll have it at the airport.
Right. One of the things that I'm actually nostalgic about is when I was growing up in the 70s, and I could go to a drugstore, any drugstore, or a Superette, or 7-Eleven, and it'd be a paperback spinner rack, and you could spin that spinner rack, and you could write, here's a new novel by somebody named J.G. Ballard. I've never heard of this guy. Oh, here's a new Robert Heinlein novel. I think I'll get this. And you could go through there and you buy these books for like 50 cents to $1. And these are brand new novels.
Yeah. It was a great time. Yeah.
It was a great time. And that world unfortunately is gone, and it's not coming back any more than the pulps are coming back.
But I think the Kindle thing, I think it's a good thing, kind of. I deal with technology a lot, and I've got very mixed feelings about it, and I've gotten the bad end of it, as everybody has, as an artist and as a musician and everything. But also, think about the Kindle. That they're getting better about the way they look and how you read them, and how for the eyes and all that. And also, you think you're not cutting down all those trees too. Sometimes I think about that. You can fit 20 books, 50 books in there, 100,000 books. I don't know where.
Well, the thing is that you can. I mean, there's a lot to be said for it, but from my perspective, the thing about it is that I'm doing much more electronic publishing, and in fact, the next 2 Captain Future novels may well be appearing as ebook first, the way that it's going. And the last collection that I put out a couple of months ago, The Doppler Effect and Other Stories, that's come out as ebook first. There's a lot of flexibility to be had in that. You kind of have to wrap your mind around things a little bit. I mean, yes, you do lose the experience of going into B&N and walking through the aisles and sort of looks kind of interesting.
Discovering something
like that. The discovery process is harder to do. And certainly, as I said in the afterword for Avengers of the Moon, I mean, I found Captain Future when I was 11 years old, and I found one of Edmund Hamilton's Captain Future novels on a spinner rack in a grocery store in Franklin, Tennessee. And that was just this random spark thing that happened when I was a kid. Who would have thought?
Was that your first science fiction book that you read?
Oh, no, not at all. My first science fiction. I've been reading science fiction for quite a while, and I was a fairly sophisticated reader by this time. I mean, I was also, at age 11, I was also reading science fiction specials and Harlan Ellison and so forth. But there was just something about Captain. I mean, it was a dated story, but there was just something so damn charming about it.
Yeah, well, after reading Harlan Ellison, Harlan Ellison's one of my favorite authors, but yeah, it's the stories are kind of dark. I think they're beautiful too, but I mean, you read something that's got that. And that's all, when people think about the Golden Age, of course, they think of it in a very stereotyped way. And some guy wrote a great blog about that, how it wasn't how people say it was about the stories. It wasn't all square-jawed guys and scientists with pipes. It was nothing like that. And that was very uncommon. In fact, the stories that are now looked on as typical. However, I think it's something just like reading the intro to The Star's My Destination and your intro to Avengers on the Moon. It's this romance, and I think in a good way, of the human endeavor. And going back to the Golden Age of science fiction, what makes a story last? I think that it says something about the human condition. I think it's, and I don't mean in a sociological way. I mean in a personal way. It says something about us. Says something about the human condition that's beautiful. And sometimes novels that are very dark maybe last, 1984 and stuff. And that says something that's very relevant about the human condition. But those books aren't ever loved the way The Star's My Destination. Well, people might say, 1984 is a great book, but when you go back and read it, it doesn't make you want to live. It kind of makes you not want to live anymore. It's such a depressing book. It's a cautionary book. I mean, there's a purpose for it.
And that's the point. That's the point of that novel.
It is art, but it's a little bit didactic. I mean, it's a little bit. So it's a warning. And those kind of books are nice, but the books that inspire, I'm talking about the books that inspire, it's like watching the stereotypical idea of the Olympics or something, right? It's something that even some people hate the Olympics. I'm not going to get into the politics of that. You know what I'm saying? The best thing of all these things is something that we all want. Life's difficult. Life's of mystery, and sometimes it's very terrifying. Sometimes it's wonderful, but we all want to be alive. We all want to live. We want to live. We want to have a meaningful life. We want to believe that life's a wonderful thing. And all the great architecture and art, there's a reason that we are awed by the pyramids, and it makes you you feel wonderful. Buildings in New York, or look at the public libraries and build in places, and it's this the old, it's like in LA, it's the statues of these different people at the top, these mythic statues, and it says like science, history, religion. It's like all the endeavors of mankind, the best of human culture that aspires to help have us transcend ourselves. And that, to me, the one thing I love about science fiction, I love fantasy because fantasy is about myth and mystery and the meaning of, to me, of being alive. The best fantasy, the best science fiction is transcendent. 2001, The Star's My Destination is unbelievably transcendent. All of those books that have that, where how can a human being transcend themselves? And I don't mean by downloading yourself into a body. Yeah. What I was saying was that, I think that these greatest works is that they inspire us, and obviously they're beautifully written, they're well written, but they say something relevant about being human and about what we can become, how we can transcend ourselves. That's one way I could think of saying it. And that's why The Star's My Destination, I love that, and The Demolished Man. They're two of my favorite, possibly two favorite novels, but especially, and both of them have that feeling, but especially The Star's My Destination.
Well, I think that in some ways science fiction sort of unknowingly picked up on the thread of transcendentalist fiction that was invented in this country in the 1700s. It was authors like Emerson and Melville. I've always thought that Herman Melville, if he was alive today, would be a science fiction writer.
Interesting.
Of course, science fiction was invented in Europe and then ported over to the U.S. and became something different. But still, I think that SF and fantasy, and fantasy, maybe even fantasy more so, picks up on a kind of a tradition of American transcendentalism.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
And did that, and has done that accidentally, but nonetheless, it's filled a void. It's filled a gap that was there. It kind of gradually evolved into that direction.
I'm afraid I'm not that versed on what would be transcendentalism. Would Melville, you're saying, would be one of those authors? Is it like naturalism kind of? And it's
well, there were people. Okay, there was a school of authors in I studied this when I was in college. There was a school of authors that came out of New England, in the 1700s, 1800s, the post-Revolutionary War period, and afterwards, who included, and they all kind of knew each other. Actually, these are all New England authors that were Melville and Hawthorne and Emerson.
And Hawthorne wrote science fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was science fiction alike. I mean, they were on that. They were sort of falling in that place, especially with Melville, with stories like with Moby Dick, especially, where they were attaching nature to human condition and vice versa.
Okay.
They were seeing the universe through the human condition and vice versa. They were mirroring each other. And in a way, science fiction kind of picked up on that, it kind of unwittingly. They were, I think, science fiction, serious SF, has always asked a lot of the same kinds of questions that the New England transcendentalists were asking. And the interesting thing about that to me is that it's done so unknowingly, unwittingly. Mm-hmm. We can't, the wheel got reinvented in a different way, which literature does. Literature reinvents itself. I mean, in science fiction, what's fascinating to me is that the space opera is something that periodically reinvents itself. Mm-hmm. It comes and goes. It has moments of popularity, and then everybody gets sick and tired of it, and it goes away for a while, and then it comes back again, and this time it's different.
That's because it becomes ugly when starts inbreeding. Like we go back to what we were talking about reading within the genre, and people start copying each other. It's like like Led Zeppelin, possibly the greatest rock band of all time, but they were, you can't blame them for all the horrible hair bands that came out of what they did. Yeah. You listen to them and it's nothing, it's got soul, and then Led Zepp a good example, because Led Zepp took their inspiration from people like Robert Johnson. American blues, right.
Right, American blues, whereas the bands that have come up behind Led Zeppelin took their inspiration from Led Zeppelin.
Right, and that goes back to what we were talking about, is that your influences, we're talking about reading in the genre, it's like, this as a musician is the same way, as a songwriter, I realized as I developed, And I became, because I do all these different things. I'm an illustrator and a composer and writer. So I've been confronted with all these different types of art practices and how to do them and what they mean. Mm-hmm. And you have to reach back far.
Yeah.
Try to find out if you like a band or you like a writer. Don't copy them. Find out what they read.
Yeah, find out what those guys did. This is again bringing it back to it. Is that I think that it's important for SF writers, particularly new writers, the ones who are coming up. I mean, there's a whole, death squad of new writers who are out there. I mean, these guys. There's like an army of them now.
I'm worried they're not reading. There's Robert Dunbar, a horror writer named Robert Dunbar. He tries to champion the horror genre, and he talked about going to some convention, and these young writers had never even heard of, I can't even remember the writers he talked about. They couldn't heard about, like, super famous early writers, like they didn't even know who they were. Like all they're reading is like modern horror, and they're regurgitating the same thing.
I'm seeing that, unfortunately, now. I'm seeing a lot of newer writers who have ignorance and honestly sometimes contempt for the writers that came before their time.
Yes, that's terrible. Yes, that's ignorant. That's really ignorant. I also look at this and say you're not going to succeed. You are not going to succeed unless you go out there and look and know the genre that you're writing, because you can't sustain a career only by living in an echo chamber, or by mirroring only that which is right around you. You bring up the transcendentalist authors, and I feel very connected to that. I feel like this when you take the soul away from something, because science fiction was never, to me, the early science fiction wasn't about. You save the day because you figure out what's wrong with the engine. I mean, that's like popular. That's Popular Mechanics. I mean, I used to get that magazine too, but it's like, I want to read a story about human condition. I want to read about a person. I want loneliness, heartbreak, strife, war. I want to read about the human condition. Why? Because I'm a human being. I hate to be speciesist, but it's like I'm reading because that's all I can relate to is biological life.
You're not interested. I mean, with a good science fiction story is not about the car, the mechanics of the car. It's about the car mechanic.
Right. That's fantastic. You should make a bumper sticker.
Well, it came right off the top of my head. But anyway, that's what it is. I mean, any story, regardless of genre, is about people.
It's a fantasy story. I couldn't give it two hoots about the king of this and that and how the magic works and what the sword does. Who gives a... It doesn't... That's why the genre doesn't matter. That's why those guys back in the day wrote all this different stuff before the pulps the literary writers did. They were writing horror stories and literary stories and everything, because you're a writer. It's part of the human condition. It doesn't matter where the human is. Yep. If he's in space or he's out in the West or he's in New England in a creepy house or whatever, it doesn't matter.
And I don't think that it's to anybody's advantage to over-specialize too much.
Right.
And it's not just in your writing habits, but it's in your reading habits. And you can't just do that. You can't become over specialized in that way, because it'll hurt your writing and so forth. I
agree. Yes. Yeah. Everything you write will become less and less relevant to reality. I mean, it's also movies. We won't even get into that. That's a whole other thing. Is that I think people are watching movies, especially in LA. I've gone to writers' clubs and readings and stuff. It's like sometimes people read stuff, and it sounds like why don't you just write a script? Because all you've done is write a script and then throw in a little bit of narration. People are already thinking about getting their book option, and it hasn't even been published yet. They're writing it like a movie. And it's like, stop watching movies. Or if you're going to, Bradbury used to say, watch a movie night, watch an old movie. Where it wasn't dependent on special effects. Watch something that's not in your genre. Watch something where the acting was beautiful, the script was beautiful, and it's like...
Well, it's absolutely necessary. It's absolutely, I go through whole periods of time where, just recently I was very ill and I was hospitalized, and I spent my time reading mystery novels. And I just took a break entirely from reading, thinking, even science fiction. That was when I was reading Cornell Woolrich and hard case crime novels and and all of these others. And when I came out of it, when I felt like, okay, now I want to read some science fiction again, then it was fresh. It was, I didn't feel like I was burned out. When I was learning the craft, as I said earlier in this interview, I studied for several years with a very fine novelist, Russell Banks. And when I went to New England College in the freshman year, he wanted people to turn in writing samples. And at that time, I was making my first attempt at a novel. And I handed him in this big chunk of this very Star Wars-y flavored science fiction novel. This is 1977 that I was writing. And Russell read this thing, and he came back to me and he said, "Okay, look, you write really very well. I can tell that you're serious about this, but I got to be honest with you. I hate science fiction. I cannot stand science fiction. I don't get it, and there's nothing I can teach you." Now, he said, "I'll make you a deal here. I'll take you under my wing. I'll teach you everything that I can if you produce and write, but you can't bring me any science fiction." Mm-hmm. And this was the first time since I had started writing at 14 or 15 years old that anybody had ever made that demand on me to not write SF or fantasy. Mm-hmm. So I had to learn to write without that convenient box of toys of spaceships and robots and telepathy and aliens and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I had to concentrate on character and development and so forth. And for a while, I even stopped reading it completely. For about 4 years, I kept my subscription to fantasy and science fiction to read Harlan Ellison's film column, but that was about it. Mm-hmm. And I came out of that when I was ready. When I started writing, when I did finally start writing SF again, after I left Russell's tutelage, some 5 years later, then I improved immensely, and by then I was now what I had not been before, and that was a publishable writer. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes it's, at least in my case, it's even the difference between failure and success in writing.
Commercially, even, yes.
Yeah.
In the long run, I mean, you might get something in a magazine if you imitate the other people that are writing that stuff, but you're never gonna. What's the purpose? I mean, what's of your life? You're never gonna to be a good writer. That should be your purpose, to be a good writer, a great writer if you can, and that is to. Just because you're going to get, I forget, some famous writer was like, he's like, you want to be published? He's like, a lot of people are published and they're not good writers. Like, you think you want these things. Yeah. This outward success. That's what everyone wants. I know so many people, they don't want to be writers. They want to be authors. A writer writes.
Good difference. Yeah, it is. I mean, Harlan said this best years ago in an interview. He said, it's easy to become a writer. The trick is staying a writer.
Yes.
Yes. And that is so bloody true.
Well, you said, I just want to go back to what you said. You said, the reason, I asked you the question, the reason to read outside your genre, to read, and for me, I read a lot of nonfiction. Like a huge amount of nonfiction. That is more inspiring. I read about ancient civilizations. I read about ancient ruins. I read about Egypt. That kind of stuff fires me up. My favorite is Freya Stark. She's the woman that traveled all over by herself in the early 1900s in Africa and all over. I mean, crazy, by herself with no one. It's the book, The Southern Gates of Arabia.
I read some years ago when Nathaniel Philbrick, who writes about American history and is probably one of the 2 or 3 best writers in that field now, honestly. His most famous story is, a lot of people read In the Heart of the Ocean. But his next book is called Sea of Glory. And it is almost a science fiction novel without being science fiction at all. But it's about the 1820 expedition that was launched by the U.S. Navy to circle the Earth. Wow. It was literally a 5-year mission. Mm-hmm. Very much like Star Trek.
I was going to say, it sounds like Star Trek.
It was real life Star Trek. I mean, these guys it was several ships, and it was a scientific expedition, and they accomplished a lot of firsts. I read that book about the time that I was getting ready to write one of my novels, Spindrift. Mm-hmm. And so much of that of Sea of Glory ended up in Spindrift,
Yeah.
that Jesus is almost plagiarism. I mean,
Right. I see what you're saying.
yeah, it's like I subconsciously took a lot of stuff.
See, that's another reason about reading outside your genre. It makes it much easier. You're talking about plagiarism. It's like all great writers is you take stuff almost directly from things, your own, whether it's your own life or things you've read. But
Sure.
but if you read that book and then you're writing about something in deep space, you translate it. It changes enough that it's not the same.
Yeah, it's a parallel.
But you've got the heart of it. Yeah.
You got the heart of it.
Okay, so Avengers on the Moon. So go back. So you read Edmund Hamilton. What was the book called? And when you were 11 years old, you found in the drugstore.
Outlaws of the Moon. So Avengers of the Moon was kind of homage to that,
right?
Using a similar title. Yes.
So when did you decide? Obviously, this is a childhood love, and it has had an effect on you. It's in the sense of wonder and adventure.
I was hearkening. I wanted to see if I could reinvent space op by channeling this part of science fiction's past, of taking this particular almost forgotten hero. Although I quickly should say that it's forgotten in the U.S. Captain Future has remained popular in Europe and in Asia for since the late 70s because of the anime series. So they've never really forgotten Captain Future in Europe, but he has been largely forgotten here in this country, the country of his origin. So
why that care? Why not some other series that you could have rebooted?
One big reason is that if you take a forgotten hero like this, you can do a lot of changes with them, and you can do updating and so forth. Where you really can't do that with something that people recognize much more.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people write Star Trek novels.
Right.
And I suppose if I really wanted to, I could have written a Star Trek novel. But Star Trek, if I had changed the part in Kirk's hair,
right,
then I would have, I would have 100,000 trekkers, whatever,
plus a call from Shatner's lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. Telling me how wrong I got this. But where with a character like a Captain Future, I can. The only people who really remember that character, besides people who read the paperbacks like myself, are those who read them in the 1940s, and I
understand what you're saying, but there's got to be more to it than that, right? I mean, because you have a connection, you have an emotional connection to it.
There is. And I wanted to write something, I wanted to do something that was a real positive kind of a story. I wanted to have a good old slam bang, old-fashioned pulp action science fiction story,
Well, I think the things that gave us the greatest joy when we were young, there's a clue there for us, I think.
Mm-hmm, right. We hold on to our, some of us are fortunate that we're able to hold on to those things that we remember from our childhood and take them forward into our adulthood and do something with them. And and I've been gratified with the generally positive response. And what's really been I've been grateful is to be able to see that people, we were just slamming millennials there a little bit, but I tell you, some of the people who've given me the best response to this character have been millennials who are discovering something that they had never heard of before, and they are, and they were willing to give it a chance.
Well, I tell you what, you know what, you can't, not judging a book by its cover, I've been surprised by some of the support I've gotten and from where it's come, and sometimes it's not where you think it's going to come from.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the way it always is, I think, in any aspect of the arts.
So, Alan, all your books can be found. You can be found on Amazon, obviously. Where would you want people to go to buy your new book, Avengers on the Moon?
No grief on Amazon or BNN. I support them too, but I'm in love with indie bookstores, and I think you should try there first.
I also want to highly recommend Tales of Time and Space, 3-time Hugo Award-winning author Allen Steele. This is a great collection of stories with a wonderful variety, a real heart to the stories, some real sense of mystery and wonder. All right, so let's... Alan, you there?
Wait.
I'm just kind of losing his signal a little bit.
Wait a second, hold on. Robert?
Yeah, are you there?
Are you still...
I think Edgar, I think we're going to lose him. Well, I think we lost him.
Oh no.
Well, that's okay. We pretty much wrapped it up anyway. So that's the show for today, folks.
Wait, tell them about the Patreon page.
Ah, good idea, Edgar. Folks, if you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a member.
Yeah, become a member of the crew.
That's right. You can become a member of the Dream Tower crew by going to www.patreon.com/literary wonder and adventure. That's patreon.com/literary wonder and adventure, one word. Or simply go to the Dream Tower Media website, dreamtowermedia.com, and there's a link there to the Patreon page.
Yeah, become a member of the crew and you can get some great gifts.
That's right, Edgar. Folks, every month Edgar and I put all of our heart and soul into this show, and you can give a little back. For as little as $2 a month, you can become a member of the Dream Tower crew. At $5 a month and more, you start to get some fabulous gifts.
Fabulous.
We'd really love to have you on board so we can keep the Literary Wonder and Adventure show going every month. And be sure to tune back in July for Part 2 of the Golden Age of Science Fiction, when Edgar and I welcome special guest, science fiction and fantasy editor Rich Horton.
Uh-oh, it's the dream phone again. Shall I answer it?
No, I need some rest.
But what if it's Allen Steele calling back?
No,
But what if it's a distress call from a ship in trouble?
no,
But what if it's a colony of beautiful space vixens that needs a man to help them repopulate their planet?